there be light. Welcome back everyone to my 20-year project. In this episode, I take the frame as far as I can before I need to start playing with the rear suspension. You'll see behind me, I'm mocking that up, but we need to save that for the next episode. So in this one, I'm going to add some temporary bracing, finish weld where I tack welded, have some awkward positioning to do some welding, get the cat mounts back, and then also the last bracing that I need to connect the old frame to the new frame. Hope you enjoy. Before I do any welding, I need to brace this thing up. That way it won't shift on me when I'm putting heat into the frame. The first areas I start welding are the top and the outside. Really easy, comfortable. I could sit on a stool while doing this. I then move to the inside part and I have to hang over top, so I'm partially upside down while I'm doing these vertical welds. Not the most comfortable, but doable. Lastly are the welds underneath, which is no fun at all. I'm basically doing a crunch the whole time and it's very awkward. I do my best, but it's not fully welded, but at least it's enough that when the frame's ready to be flipped over and the braces cut away, I'm not worried about it shifting at all. Next, I remake the diamond-shaped bracing that I had to cut off previously. I then weld it on, except for the bottom, which I'll do when I flip the frame over. Well, I've reached a decision point. There are a few things that I can do with this build that don't directly impact each other. All will need to be done to get this complete, but I could do a few things. One is finish welding the frame, but to do that I'm going to have to put some cross members so that when I weld it won't move. The other thing is starting to look at the rear suspension. The reason why that's a good idea is I have the room now without those cross members kind of in the front here to get the axle in position. And getting the axle in position is one that, starting from the first episode of this build, I have been anxious about, which is still stemmed to getting the new frame, getting the 4-link suspension all figured out. So I think I'm going to try to get the axle in position. And the way to do that, to get it back to where I had it before I started cutting away, is this. I had some 1/4-inch plate sitting around, 4 inches in width, and the axle tubes are 2 5/8 inch. So I bought a 2 5/8 inch hole saw. I know things are going to move around a little bit, but that's okay if it's a little bit bigger. So I took the plate, drilled a hole with the hole saw in the middle, and then cut it in half. The next piece was the distance. So from the top of the frame here to the top of the axle tube, when it's at right height, is supposed to be close to 12 inches. I think it's 11 and 15/16. So I measured that to make sure that this distance is the same, built 2 of them, 1 for each side. So I'm ready to go. And my plan is, let's mount it. I've also notched to here to align with the center of the hump, which is supposed to be the center of the axle. So I'll mount it on the side, get into position, and then bring the axle into position to these locators. One on each side. That should bring me to where it needs to be. And the reason I want to do that first is A, that clearance that I talked about, but B, the front or the top bars are going to a point that won't be directly on the frame. Today it'll go into space, and I need to connect that to the frame, and that's also going to be a cross member that's going to be permanent. So getting the axle located, figuring out the upper bars will give me an idea where that cross member needs to be. I could build that cross member and then go back and weld up the rest of the frame so that is permanent. So that's my plan. To get the axle located on the frame, it's fairly simple. I just need to square it up, making sure it's flush with the top of the frame hump, and that the notch is in line with the mark that I made to indicate the center of the axle. Once I do one side, I move over to the other and do the same thing. Well, a bit of a change of plans because you can see here, if I need to move back more, knowing that the axle tube's there, it's got to get back to here. But this cross member that I have supporting the rear of the frame is going to hit this if I move it any more back. So I think I'm gonna have to go with welding the frame over here. Then I could remove this cross member here and work on getting this in position. Before I can actually start welding the frame, I need to add more bracing. In this case, I'm using some angle iron, creating an X brace just to make sure this thing does not shift while I'm adding the heat. With the X brace in position, I then weld up the relief cuts that I had made previously. I am very frustrated right now. I'm trying to TIG weld the back half of the frame to the mid frame, and I don't know why I'm running into porosity. It's the story of my life. I'm scratching my head. I don't know what I'm doing wrong at this point in time, especially when things were well, had a fresh bottle, was able to get things looking great. Now, part of it could be the awkwardness, just the angle I'm on. I thought some of it could have been older metal that was welded before that I cut, but this is fresh. This section hasn't been welded before, and it's gone too much. I can't do it. I quit. I quit TIG welding. I quit TIG welding for this part. I'm just gonna make it. I need to get past to the next part of this build. So I know I just said I quit, but I'm gonna take a break, MIG weld it, and then in the next project that requires welding, I'll go back to TIG welding. But just wanted to share with everybody my frustration because I thought I figured this out. I thought I was able to get over this porosity issue, and it's just driving me insane again. Anyway, let me get back to now MIG welding the frame together. So what's minutes for you is the next day for me, and I want to go back to what I said, which is I quit TIG welding. And obviously I want to show you my frustration at the heat of the moment. After doing some research online, I think there's some settings I can do to help improve it. Now, I did go ahead and weld the rear part to the mid part using a MIG welder. So that's done, but there is still some other welds that I need to do that will require TIG welding, or well, require welding, and I can use TIG welding. And one of the things I noticed is the amperage. I had I think 135, and some of the sections, especially where I was even awkward, I noticed that I needed to back off, and I need to back off because there's a bit of a gap. So some of it is I probably had it too high. I just needed to dial it down either through the pedal or on the machine so that if I press the pedal all the way down, it wouldn't be at 130. And the welds came out okay. And I was awkward. I was basically hanging overhead, and it's a vertical weld. And again, not the best, but better, no porosity that I was running into. And I think I'm just overheating the part. So while I said I quit, I did for a bit. I think I'm gonna go back and try it, especially when I'm doing the plating and some of the other pieces to finish up the frame. I want to take a moment to talk you through a couple of joints I have that connect the rear part of the frame to the mid part. So Over here, which is what I did on the bench, I believe is called a miter cut. So the cut goes from the outside corner to the inside corner. And in this angle, it's almost vertical. However, when I was fitting this part of the frame, it's floating in space. And I found that it was a bit easier if I laid it on top of the midframe. So I went a bit of that easy route, but that means that the weld is now horizontal over here, behind here. But I wanted to make it still look good. So I had this part of the frame sticking out. I marked it, cut it, grinded, sanded it, so it gave the same shape. It's the exact same angle as over here. However, that left me with a hole because now I have an open end of the tube. So I need to cap that. And I got some 1/8 inch sheet that I have and cut out a rectangle strip that would cap that hole. But I also extended it a bit further back to give it a little bit more strength. And then lastly is this plating to give it more strength. So over here, and the goal of these is to cover as much of that weld. And because this one, the weld is almost vertical, I had it set that way. If I put in the exact same location, the weld, this top part of the plate would be right along the same as this weld across. So it's not doing its job. And therefore I had to move this up a little bit more to cover as most of that weld as I could with this plate. I do my best to weld up those rectangle caps, but given the bracing and the position that I'm in, I can't weld it all the way around. Like with other aspects of the frame, I'll finish it off when I flip the frame upside down. So next up, I'm going to work on reattaching the rear cab mounts to the frame. And they're about 1/4 of an inch away from the frame right now. So I have to come up with an idea to be able to reattach it. So this is all 1/8 inch, and my plan is to be able to weld this plate to the cab mount, and then I'll be welding on these pieces, which will extend out over to the frame. I'll have one on each side, and then afterwards, once that's on, there'll be a bit of a gap, and I'll cover that up on the side, but I'll do that once it's on the truck or on the frame. And to jig it up, what I've done is I have an offcut of the same material as the frame, so 2x3, and I'm setting it up so everything is going to be square. Get the top piece, get the bottom piece, and once I take it off here, it should be able to slide where I want it on the frame itself. So my next step right now will be to weld up this seam, flip it around, and then weld up the bottom one. Definitely a tight fit. I'm gonna have to use the mallet just to bring it into position. I was already hammering it before, so I know it's moving. Just gonna take a little bit of time. I'm working on the driver's side rear cab mount, and this is my plan. So I made the other, I'll call it an adapter plate just to push it off. And what I've done now is I actually have a laser. You can't see it with the bright light, but I have a laser because I originally had marked on the wall over here where the laser was before I removed it. And then I have marks on the other mount over there and a line that the laser should be going across and then hitting that wall. Now that I have that lined up, what I've done is I've put this piece on, knowing that it should be 1/4 inch off, and it's 1/4 inch from this face to this face.
which leaves, and since this is about an 1/8 inch thick, means I'm leaving about an 1/8 inch in there. Then this piece, which is 4 inches, I measured halfway with 2 inches and made sure that the laser is hitting there in the midway mark. So now I know that this piece is off of this frame the right amount and it's centered. So then the next thing I'm going to do, because if I clamp the mount to this, it might push it in. So I want to add a couple of tacks in the top, probably on the bottom too. So that's going to be fun to be upside down. And then that way I can start to position the mount back to where it needs to be. And the way I'll do that is I actually have lines on the top where the laser needs to be. And I know that it needs to be 11 and 7/32 from the nose down to the frame table. So next step, let's get some tack welds and then I could figure out how to mount this and clamp it on. The driver's side cam mount is still connected to the old frame that I cut away. So first thing I need to do is detach it. I start off with drilling out the plug welds with a hole saw, and then I cut away all the tacks and separate it from the old frame. Lastly, I clean up any of the welds that remain so that it's ready to go. Now with the cab mounts all tacked in, I turn my attention to one last brace that I need to put in. That is where the old 3x3 frame meets with the new 2x3 frame on the inside, because there's a bit of a gap there. And I start off by using some 1/8 inch plate, mark it in 2 spots because I need to make it into a Z shape. I do that on the bench by hammering it while it's in a vise. Once the brace is fitting well, I drill out some holes for some plug welds. The brace is clamped to the frame, and you can see there's still a triangle-shaped gap, which I'll address in a bit. While clamped, I tack weld the top and also on the bottom. Then I fully weld it along the top and the sides, and here I address the gap by adding a triangle-shaped filler piece.
So I'm at a point where I've done as much welding on the frame as I can before addressing the cross members. And in order to do the cross members, I need to figure out what the rear suspension is. And you might say, well, hey, this cab mount is only tack welded. You could finish welding that. And the reason why I've left it like this is I've actually created some doubt in my mind if this is in the right position. And that's because when I measured it after the old frame sprung back and put it slightly out of position. When I measured it from the top of here to the frame table, it was 11 and 17/32, and I have it written here. When I used that measurement to put it back, I noticed it seemed high. Also, it previously had some tack welds and the witness mark of that tack weld still there, and that was high. And I'm going from a 3-inch tall frame to a 3-inch tall frame. So that tack witness mark should be fairly close to the frame, maybe slightly hidden by this adapter because I wouldn't have had an adapter on the old frame. So I was a little worried and checked the front mounts. They seem to be okay, but the rear mounts, yeah, I created some doubt. Now I do know that the driver's side mounts need to be an 1/8 inch lower, and that's because on the cab itself there's these locating plates and they're about an 1/8 of an inch thick. And when I measure from the bottom of the rocker panel to the part that the mount's going to be touching on the driver's side, it's about an 1/8 inch closer to the bottom of the rocker panel. So these mounts on the driver's side need to be an 1/8 inch lower, which I did double confirm the front one is. So in the rear, I measured the passenger side, took into account an 1/8 inch lower, and that's where I set it now. But because I created that doubt, I've decided leave it tacked. I'm gonna spend money on beer and pizza, get some friends over, test mount the cab before I weld it up. Once I know it's either right, or if it's off, figure out how far it's off, then make the adjustment and finish weld. Now I still have to weld on the bottom. You can still see the plug welds aren't done up here, and that's just from positioning. It'll be easier. I got to do some welding on the frame on the bottom, so I'll take the time once I have the cross members, flip it over, weld it, and while I'm flipping it, I will also do the plug welds. I'm gonna wrap things up here, but in the next episode, we're gonna be able to crack this open and start working on the rear suspension. I hope you enjoyed. Please like, please subscribe, leave a comment, and we'll see you next time.